All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending and welcome to our latest Faith in Context presentation. Today we're going to be talking about specifically the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and the Church's role in that. And we are very happy to welcome Brenda Gunn, who is going to be our presenter today. So a little bit about Brenda. Brenda is a law professor at the University of Manitoba and the academic and research director at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg. After earning her Juris Doctor at the University of Toronto and an LLM in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy at the University of Arizona, Brenda worked at a community legal clinic in Guatemala on a case of genocide submitted to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. She has also worked with Manitoba First Nations on Aboriginal and treaty rights issues. Brenda continues to be actively involved in the international Indigenous peoples movement. She developed a handbook that is one of the main resources in Canada on understanding the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has delivered workshops on the Declaration across Canada and internationally. And Brenda also grew up attending St. Luke's Zion here in Winnipeg. So thank you, Brenda, for being here to present with us today. I'll hand things over to you. And again, if people have questions along the way, then feel free to either raise your hand virtually or for real, and we'll work to address those questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be joining you today. I admit to being a little bit nervous because my mom and dad are in the audience, and somehow when your parents are present, it always just puts on a little bit more pressure. I guess even at 43, I'm looking to still make sure I'm doing them proud. So I want to thank everyone for joining us on a Saturday morning. Acknowledge friends that are also in the audience. Thank you for joining us today and for asking me to come and speak with all of you. So I think the format for today is going to be fairly simple and straightforward. We're going to spend about 45-50 minutes and I'll give a presentation where I'll give a bit of the background of residential schools and some of the other systems that were active throughout the 20th century in Canada. And then we'll move into a little bit of some conversation about, the role of the Lutheran Church in all of this, and where we hope to end up is some conversation about what we can do moving forward. And so after I guess 45 minutes is not short. Let's be realistic. After what might feel like a very long presentation, we'll take a short break and then we'll go into some smaller groups, have some time for conversations amongst participants before we come back and start sharing some of the ideas with the larger group. So that's the lay of the land for today. I also want to acknowledge that I am presenting here in Winnipeg today. So that is Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Winnipeg is also home to many other Indigenous peoples, and including many Inuit who now live here. So grateful for the hospitality that they always provide us while being on their lands. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Just a note now that I've got the screen shared, I have limited ability to see participants. So if there are questions that are being raised, I'm hoping Bishop Jason can help moderate those if there's questions as we go along, but there'll also be lots of time for questions throughout the day as well. So before I get into talking about residential school history, I want to share a bit of information about my workplace, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So some of you may have heard about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. It was a truth commission that existed from 2009 to 2015 that came out of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the settlement of the largest class action in Canada's history. And the Truth Commission traveled coast to coast to coast to hear from survivors, and to really try to understand and piece together the history and legacy of the residential school system. Part of the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to establish a national research center that could continue on the work that was started with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, knowing that no one was going to be able to piece together centuries of history in 5 years. And so the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, that is hosted at the University of Manitoba, is that legacy body. So we exist for 3 main reasons. We hold the archive, including all of the materials gathered by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We continue to acquire new records all of the time. Some of you may have heard news this summer about some work we've been doing with the Oblates to try to get access to their archives and their materials that they have. In fact, our senior archivist had the opportunity to go to Rome in July. Oh, sorry, our head of archives. Our head of archives went to Rome in July to go and look through some of the Vatican records to see if there are records there that are relevant to residential school history, and to work on arrangements for the National Center to access those. We also engage in research to further understand the history and legacy of residential schools. And we also engage in education, outreach, and other public events. And so today's presentation is part of our public education and outreach program. And so that's the 3 main areas that we work in. I just want to share really briefly about our archive, because it's really a wealth of information and a place that people can go to learn more about the history of residential schools. So our collection includes over 5 million records. It includes hours of audio and video footage, and we'll watch about 3 minutes of that this morning. We have records from governments and church, as well as we have over 7,000 statements provided by residential school survivors themselves that were gathered during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. And as a side note, we continue to gather statements even today. It should be noted that our archive, the 5 million records, not all of those are public records. You can imagine that records that speak to children's attendance at school can include very personal and private health information and a range of private information. And so there's only a portion of our archive that is currently publicly available. We do work, though, to continue to review all of the 5 million records that we hold and make decisions to try to proactively release, is the term we use. But that basically just means moving things from the private archive into the public archive, as long as we can ensure privacy is respected. There is a way for researchers and survivors themselves to reach out to the NCTR and access our private records. Our archivists on staff will do searches in the entire archive and can provide survivors of residential schools packages of information from our archive that are relevant to their experience. So there are ways to access the private archive. It's just not fully publicly available. Okay, so that's the work we do. And now I just want to provide a short history of residential schools. And as we get going, again, I'm going to just be skipping along the surface. There's no way in a 45-minute presentation that I can cover all of the details and all of the history. I also recognize that some of you have probably heard some of this history before, and for some, this could be new information. And so I'm hoping that it will provide a refresher for those of you who may have known aspects of this history, as well as provide a good introduction for those of you who might be hearing this for the first time. So the residential school system in Canada was a system of boarding schools that existed coast to coast to coast. And while we call them schools, it's important to note that education was not the primary goal of these institutions. We've seen through government records, through church records, that the primary goal of these institutions was to remove children from the influence of their families and of their communities, to take away their ability to speak Indigenous languages, participate in their culture, and to forcefully Christianize these children. So from all the records that the TRC and others have seen, it's important to understand that these schools were not about educating as the primary goal. It was about Christianizing children, taking them away from their Indigenous religions and cultures and values and practices and bringing them into the Christian belief based on the belief at the time that Christianity was superior. And so some of the schools were very large. Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia had over 500 students at some points in time. Other schools were quite small as 77 students at a time. So as we talk about residential schools, it's important to note that there wasn't a template that existed for residential schools coast to coast to coast. They really varied over the vast geography of Canada. They varied over time. They also varied depending on who was working there or the Christian church that was running them. So residential schools in Canada were funded by the federal government, but they were run by various Christian churches, with the majority of the churches being run by the Catholic Church. During the 150 years that residential schools existed in Canada, the rules and laws and regulations that related or that oversaw residential schools really changed over time. And so the time period that we see most children attending residential schools is around the 1920s and to about the 1950s. And during this period of time, the Indian Act, federal legislation that regulates all aspects of First Nations lives, required children to attend residential schools from the ages of 7 to 15. So that was when we see the largest number of children attending residential schools. We should note that the last residential school in Canada closed in, or the last residence of the residential schools closed in 1996, with the last school closing in 1998. So for some perspective, my husband is Cree, he's a First Nations man. He graduated high school in 1996. So if he had been in southern Saskatchewan at the time that he was finishing school and part of the First Nations there, he might have attended residential school. So this is not history that's far away. It's history that is very real to many people in Canada. The slide says it's estimated that 150,000 children attended residential school throughout this time frame. We say estimated because there was no obligation for churches to record who was attending school, who left the school, where the children were coming from. There was no infrastructure that existed to track children and to capture these numbers. So we and the Truth and Reconciliation have been able to estimate the numbers through a variety of records, including records. There were some attendance records, quarterly reports that were provided, as well as there's records that speak to sort of rations and how much food was being used. And so when you hear numbers, those are generally numbers that can be confirmed, so that we've been able to find records and identify a child that was attending residential school. So it's always fair to assume when you see numbers that there's going to be more children who attended, but we are still working to piece together those exact numbers. In my slides, I have a lot of pictures of the children, because we work really hard at the National Center to keep survivors and the children front and center in what we do. And so on the screen now is a picture of a young boy named Thomas Moore. And on the left, you can see a picture of what he looked like when he went to residential school before he got there. You can see long hair. You can see a very elaborate regalia that he's wearing, clothes that had a lot of intricate details, probably made from family members. And then on the right, you can see what his appearance when he was at residential school. So the cutting of the hair, the change of clothes, etc. So really, I think visually shows that forced transformation that children were forced to go through. And so, as I stated, residential schools was not about education. I think that's one of the lessons that I really try to get across to people, because sometimes we think, oh, well, school is good and overall it's good that education was provided, but then some bad things happened. Part of what we need to really come to grips with, I think, in Canada, when we're trying to understand the residential school history, is that the schools were not about education. It was about getting rid of a problem that the government was facing, trying to find a way for there not to be any more Indians or Indigenous peoples in Canada. And schooling, where kids were removed from their families, was viewed as the best way to achieve this policy goal. So, as I mentioned, residential schools existed across the country. This is one map we have that shows the location of residential schools, so coast to coast to coast. There are a bunch of different ways that we can think of residential schools and classify and understand the different schools. Because the National Center was created through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, our starting point for work are schools that were recognized under the settlement agreement. But that settlement didn't actually cover all schools. And so there's a range of other schools. So we do try to include a range of different schools. So in Eastern Canada, that was just really hard hit by a hurricane last night. You can see some purple dots. The residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador were reparations were provided through a separate agreement. So, but there were residential schools there. The first residential schools that opened were in southern Canada. So you might be able to see some dots near the bottom of southern Ontario with some purple circles. That would be some of the first schools that opened. And then the last school that was closing is that blue circle in Saskatchewan. So there were a broad range of schools. The different color dots also represent the different denominations that were involved in running the different schools. Okay. So now I want to share one of the hardest parts of this presentation, which is the experiences of children at the schools. So before I get into talking about some of this, I want to highlight that because there was no template, no sort of boilerplate approach to residential schools over the 150-year experience, it's not possible to say this is what going to school was like. We have to recognize that school experiences really varied coast to coast to coast. They varied from when the residential schools first opened in the 1830s to the 1990s, right? They would have varied depending on, the specific teachers, the specific administrators. So, but what the TRC heard from the over 7,000 survivors that they spoke to, what they saw from the records are a lot of similarities, and that's what I'm going to sort of focus on today. So when children arrived at residential schools, they would have been stripped of their personal belongings, sometimes never to be seen again. And it's this story of children losing their personal belongings that we find the origins of Orange Shirt Day. And I acknowledge Bishop Jason for wearing his orange shirt today. This is based on Phyllis Webstad's story of her grandmother taking her shopping before going to residential school, buying her a beautiful new shirt. And the first day she showed up, the shirt was taken and she never saw it again. And so Orange Shirt Day is a visual reminder of the way in which residential schools were about stripping Indigenous children of their connection to their families, communities, and cultures. They would have then been often bathed and looked for any sort of vermin, lice sort of things, and also having potentially hair cut. And I just want to very briefly talk a little bit about what I've been able to learn about the significance of the hair being cut for many children. And again, this wouldn't be the same across the country necessarily, because First Nations cultures and beliefs and languages vary across the country, but at least around Manitoba, around the prairies, what I've heard and what I've learned about hair is that many First Nations had long hair, not as sort of just a style, but it was a way to remind people of their connection to land, about connection to family. For example, when my daughter was very little and we saw some of her relatives from her Cree relatives from up north, one of her, I guess he'd be a great uncle, perhaps is what we would say. He looked at her and said, treasure your hair. Your hair is your gifts. This is where your gifts come from. So hair has a very strong cultural belief for many First Nations, at least in Prairie Canada. Relatedly is also the cultural practice that hair would have only been cut if someone had died. So it was part of a mourning ritual for many First Nations in the prairies. And so I've heard stories of children who were at residential school having their hair cut, not speaking the language of the adults that are doing it, who had assumed that someone at home must have died, but they didn't know who, and they weren't able to connect with their family. So very traumatic experiences for many ways. It's not just about getting a haircut you didn't like, but it was a very, for many children, would have been very traumatic, of a severing of their connection to their family, to their culture, to their land. And then on top of this, being little and thinking that someone may have died. So we call them schools, and there was some education provided, but there was very low educational expectations. There was a very strongly held belief that Indigenous children were incapable of learning. And so education was just not part of what needed to be provided. It was really strongly focused on religious aspects, and then the labor that would have been involved to keep the schools self-running. There was also no system-wide qualifications for teachers in these schools. So over the 150 years that schools were running, there wasn't always any requirement for any of the teachers to have any education or experience teaching. They were often low-paying jobs. They, could have been in remote areas. So the quality of education, even when it was provided, was not well regulated. I suppose I should probably share a little bit about the pictures, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of photos on this presentation. And we share the photos because for many kids, it would be the only pictures that they have of themselves at this age. But we also want to recognize that these pictures were often taken by the churches running the schools themselves, and would have been taken for specific purposes, right? So you'll see, children often sitting around what looks like schools. You'll see the smiling faces, but I don't think the pictures always convey what the children would have been experiencing at the schools, but they do form an important part of the records. So the federal government was always looking for ways to cut costs during the school system. So there was an expectation for the schools, as much as possible, to be self-supporting, which meant that the children were involved in a lot of the labor aspects of the school, and not always doing chores that would have been viewed as age appropriate at the time. They were often involved in quite dangerous work. So beyond the labor aspects of participating in the schools, schools were also very challenging for children, as there was often not enough food provided to the children. It was often very low quality food, devoid of many essential nutrients. It also would have been really strange food for children. So children who had been taken from their homes, put in a place where they didn't speak the language. Even if they had siblings at the school, they often were still very separated. And then on top of that, having very strange new food and not enough of the food was really a large aspect of what many survivors talk about their experiences, is that sort of hunger. So students would have been involved in preparing the meals and in cleaning the up after the school, or after the meals. Throughout, the girls would have been involved in various aspects of sewing, especially creating outfits so that when they were out in public, they could be seen as being well dressed, involved in the sewing and laundry. So the next aspect of school experiences that I want to share is the discipline. And there's a lot that can be said about the harshness of the discipline that was involved at the time. And even though harsh punishment might have been part of schooling in other areas, I think there's a couple of points that are really significant to note at this point. One, again, there was no regulation or no consideration of of the standard of care that was required to provide to these children, including no regulations about discipline. So schools were like unregulated, and teachers and administrators of the school could really do anything they wanted, and there was no repercussions and no limits. There was a range of very significant, severe punishment, and it was chronic, right? It wasn't a sort of one off, but it was for many children a daily occurrence. And so many students and survivors of residential schools, when they look back, we throughout the TRC and throughout the process of documenting this history, the very severe, harsh discipline was a common theme. There was also profound systemic abuses happening throughout the school. And the abuse that existed was known. It was known to many of the churches that ran the institutions. And in many instances, if anything would be done, if a priest who was running the school was found to be abusing children, what often occurred was just simply moving that priest from one school to another school. And it continues to be, I think, one of the hardest things for me to really come to terms with, because the abuse was so profound and throughout the system. And when you couple it with, no criteria for what teachers had to do, and the low pay, it really became a place where churches and government knew of the situation. But again, the primary goal was to deal with the Indian problem, to remove the Indian from the child. And so there was no attempts, there was not a lot of any prosecution, very limited investigation. So the abuse was allowed to just continue. Due to the chronic underfunding and overcrowding of residential schools, the health in schools was horrendous. Tuberculosis was, of course, a huge problem throughout Canada for a long period of time. However, it continued to plague many First Nations and many residential schools long after tuberculosis had been addressed in Canada. And even when tuberculosis, for example, was known to be a really big problem, students were never screened when they showed up at residential schools. So the administrators didn't care or didn't bother to sort of check to make sure that the kid was healthy before they introduced them into schools that were overcrowded and underfunded, underfed, under chronic stress that would have led to very poor health outcomes for many of the children who attended residential schools. Relatedly, part of the government didn't regulate this system. There are not clear records that the churches were required to keep on how many children died at residential schools. So we continue to do work at the National Center to try to identify the names of children who died at residential schools. And so there's an estimate that 1 in 25 children died while attending residential schools, which, as the slide shows, is higher than during various wars. So some of you might have heard stories over the last year in the news about work that is happening at former residential school sites to identify missing children and unmarked burials. And this relates to the fact that most residential schools had cemeteries because the government would not fund or not pay for, and the churches would not pay to send children who died at school back to their families. So they would have been buried at the schools. The situation of unmarked burials is quite complicated, and it exists for a number of reasons. Not all of the graves were always clandestine, and not all of the deaths would have been due to direct criminal activities of people running the churches, but, related, for example, to the health conditions. And so one of the situations is, again, the government has never regulated these school sites and cemeteries. So there was no requirement for the churches to maintain the cemeteries once the schools closed. And so even where cemeteries were marked at the time, like the one on the picture, that was not, they were not maintained after they are closed. So today it's a matter about finding those grave sites. So a lot of really challenging situations for children who attended residential schools. I want to note that for many, and for some of the children, when they attended residential schools, they participated in sports and music and drama and art. And some survivors of residential schools talked about the sense of value that engaging in these activities provided, and that they provided a place of refuge and sometimes even a source of pride. And so we really want to honor the stories and the truths of survivors who note positive experiences at residential schools, including the accomplishments of many arts and sports teams. But it is important to note that even where individual students had positive experiences at residential schools, that does not undermine or take away from the fact that the system was set up to forcefully assimilate and Christianize children and to break up families and existing communities and cultures. So we need to make sure when we're thinking about residential schools and how we move forward, that there's individual students' experiences, but there's also the goals of the larger system. Children at a Christmas play, engaging in some pottery. So residential schools overall were a very negative experience for most students who attended. It was challenging for the families who were left at home. But I want to highlight that Indigenous families did not just sit idly by. The children resisted and found ways to survive while at residential schools. Parents did their best to sometimes hide children from being taken to residential schools, or sometimes tried to remove them. And this could be, there were times when there were very high criminal fines and potential of imprisonment for failing to send kids to residential schools. So the resistance that came could come at a high cost. But communities resisted throughout this history. They did not just sit by and let this happen. So the kids, the families, the communities all resisted, and tried to really change the system and lobby for education for children that was focused on education and not on just simply Christianization. So the school experiences, again, broad, challenging to hear about. Before I get into starting to think about what we can do, I just want to highlight one more aspect, and that's the legacy of residential schools and some of the intergenerational impacts, because residential schools were not the only way in which the government tried to assimilate Indigenous children into Western ways. And it's important to note that many of the systems that worked alongside the residential schools continue to exist. And continue to have the goal or the impact of assimilation, of bringing Indigenous children out of their cultures and into Western Christian ways. And so it's important to note that many of the individual and collective harms have not yet been redressed, even though we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and even though there was some reparation funding provided to individual survivors. Many of the political and legal policies and mechanisms that created the residential schools continue to exist today. We have intense racism against Aboriginal people in society and in various systems. There's horrific stories of racism against Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system. And many languages continue to be critically endangered today. So I just want to highlight that even today, we're a few decades beyond residential schools, that there are many areas of the Canadian system that continue to perpetuate the damage that was caused by residential schools. So the profound overrepresentation in the justice system, profound, like astonishingly high rates of Aboriginal children in care. And there have been studies and decisions by courts over and over again that the overrepresentation in these systems is not just due to poor parenting or over criminality. It's actually systemic racism in how we view Indigenous peoples, what we assume their situation to be, and having whole systems that continue to remove individuals from their families and from their communities. And even the education system, the federal government continues to fund First Nations education at significantly lower rates than other provincial schools. And this leads to lower educational outcomes for many First Nations children, which then has impacts on ability to go to post-secondary school or to get jobs. And so the machinery that was sort of behind the residential schools is still really, really active today. And so this slide, you don't need to read all of these words, but really what I just wanted to highlight here is that we have the Canadian courts recognizing systemic racism in the legal system. We have a study out of BC acknowledging the widespread racism against Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system. The idea of profound discrimination and racism against Indigenous children in the child welfare system, right? So these are things we know, and we still continue to impact. So the system continues to be a problem, but also there is, of course, intergenerational impact. So people who went to residential schools, and in some families, it's generations of people who went to residential schools, right? So it's a mother and her grandparents and her or her parents and her grandparents, right? So you can have multiple generations. that went to residential schools. And it continues to profoundly affect the individual as well, and their family and their ability to be there for their family. And so I'm almost done this part of the presentation, but I just want to highlight the work of the National Center, of course, focuses on sharing the history and legacy of residential schools. That's our clear mandate. But there are other policies and things in place that we're also having this goal of Christianizing and taking away Indigenous people's culture and really trying to end their being Indigenous peoples. This occurred through hospitals. There was Indian hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoriums that were running throughout the 20th century. And even the hospitals having a mandate of working with churches and seeing hospitals as a place to Christianize patients. Beyond residential schools, maybe I'll flip through some of these slides. We also, there was the 60 scoop, where once families had been through residential schools, there was a process of apprehending children from mostly First Nations families and placing them with non-Indigenous families. And so the 60 scoop, well, we call it the 60 scoop. This actually happened through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So generations after residential schools of, again, families being torn apart through government policies and trying to place the children with other families. There were also day schools. So there were schools that were run by churches, again, where students resided with their families and attended schools during the day. Unfortunately, the students suffered similar abuses to those who attended residential schools. So it was through the education, through school, that a lot of people experienced profound abuse. I started talking about some of the hospitals and the tuberculosis sanatoriums. Okay, so that's an overwhelming high-level overview of some of Canada's history in the relationship with Indigenous peoples. I, of course, don't want to leave us there because that is a lot to try to digest and to sit with. So what I want to do now, and then we'll quickly move into having a break and having some discussion time. I want to look at the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did to try to address this history. And so I'm going to focus probably just on the calls to action and not a main part of my work, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That we might have to save for another day. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after their study, came up with a list of 94 actions that needed to be taken to try to start the process to address the history of residential schools. And you can see on this slide the different sectors that were addressed. Notably, at least for myself in the work that I do, justice has the most number of calls to action. And I think that must be a sign that the justice system is one of the biggest systems that's having a big impact and failing Indigenous peoples the most. That there are calls to action that specifically relate to churches. And so I selected one to highlight here because some of the calls to action specifically relate to churches that were running the residential schools and were part of that settlement agreement. But there are some calls that make that are a little broader. And so call to action 60 says we call upon the churches and, and seminaries and all those things. One, to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right. And then also to learn about the history and legacy of residential schools. and the rules of church in that system, to understand the history and legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities, and the responsibilities that churches have to mitigate such conflicts and spiritual violence. And so one of the things that has come as a result of the residential school system and other efforts to Christianize Indigenous peoples has been a very in some communities, a very significant divide in communities between those who follow Christianity and those who continue to follow Indigenous spirituality. And that is a division that is very damaging and hard in many communities. That sort of wedge that has been put in the communities, and is something that many communities are working through. So when we talk about what do we do about all of this, the NCTR has identified some actions that people can take towards reconciliation, or people have started using the term reconciliation. So learning the history is such an important first step. This is why the NCTR, as part of our mandate, shares this history with as many organizations as we can get to in any given year. But we also want to recognize that learning the history is the first small step, right? So first you have to learn the history, then you really have to understand that history and how it impacts you and the relationships you have and your responsibility. And through processes of learning and understanding, we really want to get people to the point where they're taking actions to start addressing the historical injustices and the present day wrongs. And so this is where I want us to spend the remaining time. And so what I want us to think about are the different levels in which reconciliation exists, or that you can take your reconciliation. So at the micro level, at the individual level, at the family level, the meso level, the communities, the neighborhoods, the schools, the organizations, but also at the macro level, the big level, the systemic level, right? So what are the different ways in which, you as an individual, as a member of a church, as the church itself, can really move to take action? So there's a few things about being an ally, and I think I'm going to skip there, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask Bishop Jason to share a clip with all of you that National Bishop Susan Johnson made in 2013 at one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's national events. And so it's about 3 to 5 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly, and we can maybe just hear her words and use that to sort of ruminate on before we get into small group discussions.
I'd now like to call upon National Bishop Susan C. Johnson of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. Thank you.
I begin by acknowledging that we are gathered today on Treaty 6 territory, on the traditional territory of the Plains Cree people. Survivors of the Indian residential schools, family and descendants of survivors, commissioners, elders, youth, distinguished guests, leaders, and all who gather today. As National Bishop, I bring you greetings on behalf of the 150,000 members and 550 congregations of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And I'd like to invite members of my church to stand now, those who are here, so that you will know that this is not just my greeting, but it comes on behalf of my whole church. I am honored and humbled to be here today. I and my church continue to have much to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples and about the history and difficult legacy of residential schools. Too often, our church has ignored these realities. We now seek opportunities to listen, to learn, to repent, and to discover paths of healing. As an expression of reconciliation, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada offers a certificate and a pottery pitcher, both blessed by our National Church Council. The certificate contains the 2011 National Convention resolution that commits our church to encouraging right relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. During this convention, we explored the meaning of treaties as sacred covenants. The adopting of this resolution was our way of making a covenant with each other in the presence of God to do our part in seeking the renewal of relationships. We now give you our word that our church is committed to an ongoing process of finding truth and reconciliation together. It is our hope that the sincerity of our covenant will be demonstrated in our actions and in our attitudes. We understand this to be both an urgent and a long-term commitment. Along with this certificate, we offer as an expression of reconciliation this pottery pitcher commissioned for our 2011 convention to be given as gifts to those we wish to honor. Created with a spirit of gratitude, we offer it in thanksgiving for the opportunity to make an expression of reconciliation. As something of ours that we now offer to this sacred process, it is symbolic of a promise to give up all that we may need to give up so that reconciliation may occur. Our Lutheran tradition teaches that reconciliation is a gracious and precious gift from God. For true reconciliation to happen, the Creator must stir hearts. It is the Creator who opens eyes and ears and souls that we may have the courage to speak truth, the patience to listen, the wisdom to confess, and the humility to show respect. It is the Creator who calls us to hope for a better future and for a healing journey that will bring us to true community. I know that the members of my church will need to draw on many spiritual resources to make this journey, and I pray that everyone will find appropriate spiritual and community support. Today, I conclude, as the certificate concludes, with these words from the Christian scriptures. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. In these words, we hear a call to humility, an invitation to listen, and a sign of hope for reconciliation. Miigwech. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for helping with the tech and sharing that clip. So again, that was National Bishop Susan Johnson in 2013, making a statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the national event in Edmonton. So we're about 9 years or so down the road from that commitment that was made. So maybe I can take a few questions now, and then we'll move into a break. I don't know if anyone.
So Brenda, there was one question earlier on from Ken, and he was wondering, you had a statement up with a political figure in the background about the purpose for Indian residential schools, and he was just wondering who made that statement.
Okay, yes. So I think that was the "I want to get rid of the Indian problem" statement. That was Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of the Indian Affairs Office.
Okay, thank you. And Colleen has a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brenda, very much. I have a question about, well, I've heard a lot about fixing the Indian problem. And I'm wondering, was there ever an identification specifically about what the problem was? What is the problem that needs to be fixed?
That's a really wonderful question. Thank you so much for it. It was sort of named, but it was also sort of assumed we all knew the problem that Indians were causing. I think most simply what the government saw as the problem, and what the churches saw as the problem, is that there were Indigenous peoples here in what we now call Canada. And so from the government's perspective, the problem was that there were Indigenous peoples here, and they posed a political and moral obstacle to setting up a new country. Over time, that problem evolved to understand that in places like in Winnipeg, through most of the MNO Synod, there would have been treaties signed where there were promises made on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen on what that relationship was going to look like. And it included an annual coming together and the sharing of gifts, and to pay certain amounts in exchange for settlers to come in and use the lands. And so there was an actual cost to those relationships and maintaining those relationships. So I think from the government's perspective, the problem was, we want to set up Canada and we want to do so as we do it, but there's this problem because there's people who were here first. From the church's perspective, I think the problem was that the people that were here were pagan savages, would have been what was discussed through the records. And so the inferiority that existed if you were an Indigenous person. And so I think the problem from the church's perspective was the lack of Christianity and the sort of higher sense of value that that the church believed it had, by that sort of moral superiority. And so that need to sort of save the Indigenous peoples from themselves.
So simply that they existed.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lynn has a question.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about language, and like you use the term, Christianizing a lot, Brenda, and I'm sure that's what people at the time, that's the phrase, or that's the word they would have used. And I guess I'm thinking that it's people at the time kind of equated Christianity with European culture. And so, like, to me, a lot of it was based on a misunderstanding of what it means to be Christian. Like, to me anyways, most of the residential schools had nothing to do with Christianity or with teaching the Christian faith, but kind of with a gross misunderstanding of what that means, and more just wanting to kind of assimilate them into European kind of culture. So I'm not entirely sure what my question is, but I'm just, because I know it's difficult to figure out what kind of language to use, and but yeah, that's just an observation, I guess, and I'm not dissing you for using that language. I'm just kind of reflecting on whether there's anything that's more accurate.
So if I may, two responses, Pastor. One is, well, first, let's do a caveat. I am not an expert on Christian religion by any stretch of the imagination. But from what I've seen that was happening at residential schools being run by churches, it was like, so churches were involved in this process. They agreed to run the schools, not to make money, but because it was part of their mission to Christianize. So I think we can't get away from the fact that, why did churches do this? Like, because they weren't educating, right? Like, they weren't finding people in their churches who knew how to teach math, who knew how to teach English. They knew one thing, right? It was the Bible. But I think your point being is also reflects a real challenge today. And this is even my own experiences hearing from you and hearing from Bishop Jason. The interpretation and the approach to the scriptures today and the understanding of what Christianity is and the values and how we live is not today. And I can't say what it was back then because I don't know, I haven't studied that, but I can with a lot of confidence say that the people who were running the schools believed they were teaching Christianity. Now, what happens today when we have a different understanding and a different aspiration of what Christianity means? And so I'm not sure if it's a historical not using the right term, or if it's just even how a religion evolves, right? I would say, just as I would say with most Indigenous spirituality, spiritualness and culture evolves over time, right? So how do we sort of reconcile that even today and that work? And then part of it, then I think maybe what you might experience is the baggage that you and the church may be confronting when what people think as being Christian is not what you think being Christian is, right? That there is potentially a disconnect. And part of that is what people may know or think they know or have experienced of Christianity may be very profoundly different from the messages and approaches that are being taken by the church today. And so I think that's a really great question and topic to explore as we move through some of the questions. But whether or not the people got the Bible right who were teaching in these schools, they were definitely of the perspective that they were engaging in this work to Christianize. And whether or not we would reflect today that as that, or even at the time, maybe, other people at the time would have said, well, that's not what the Bible says, and this sort of Christianizing mission is inappropriate. But I don't see a lot of that in the records of other churches standing up at the time and saying this sort of work that you're doing to Christianize isn't really what we see the scripture as saying. I don't know if that's a helpful response, but I definitely think I understand the struggle that you're highlighting.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. You've just framed it in a slightly different way. So thank you.
Tyler?
Just maybe a bit of a follow-up question. I've heard it said that like Lutherans weren't part of the residential school problem. But what I appreciated when I heard that said also was the caveat that we weren't speaking English at the time. And so I think in some ways we've kind of wanted to step away from responsibility in that. And I think where we're at now is kind of a time to say we are part of the system. I mean, by virtue of being settlers, by virtue of being of European descent, by being here, it can be a really hard conversation to get into. And I suppose maybe some of the small group stuff I would ask, where are some of those starting points? given that we're actually past a starting point. I mean, we've had resolutions for over a decade now as a national church. We've been working at this for a chunk of time, but there's still, I've experienced some resistance just in the last couple of years around how to engage it. I'll say that the very sad news of the children's bodies found in the Kamloops site has kind of opened the doors to people acknowledging systemic issues more. And if I can say, I'm grateful for that revelation, or maybe for that confirmation of what people have been saying for years already, because it's opened those doors. So kind of a comment, and maybe my question is, how do we push people a little bit? Because we have a lot of people in our pews who are like, I'm old, I'm in my ways, I'm not at a point where I can change. It's like, well, actually, I think there's still ways that we can. I don't always know how.
Excellent. Thank you for the comment and question. So, in preparation for today's workshop, the conversations we had was, how to have this conversation. I decided not to directly state that the Lutheran Church was not running any of the IRSA, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, schools, right? So I think you're right that there's a really easy out for the church to say, not my problem, right? And to sort of maybe even like a little pat on the back to try to think, but that's also why in the presentation, I decided, and through our conversations, we thought I would touch upon what is the challenge ahead of us, right? And is it like getting through residential school history, or recognizing that the residential school system was a big part of a much larger machine? And and I think this even connects to Pastor Lynn's comment about and question about how do we define and understand what is Christianity, right? And so if we think about, the problem being moving over residential schools, maybe the Lutheran Church has, a limited role. But if we think about the problem as being like colonialism in Canada, and that large numbers of people have moved to this country with a goal to convert the original inhabitants into a different form of religion, and at some points that conversion was more violent than other points, maybe there's a responsibility and an opportunity to think about how we work together and live alongside one another, right? Which is also why I decided to include that call to action about respecting Indigenous people's spirituality, right? So I think there's opportunities and responsibilities that are part of any church that is operating in Canada to think about, how do they approach living alongside Indigenous peoples who have maybe different spiritual religious beliefs, right? And how do we sort of reconcile? And I think when I think about the sort of big picture, I see a lot of opportunities for the Lutheran Church to really consider the questions. And that's sort of some of what I hear, at least, in the statement that was made at the 2013 event.
Thank you.
So the questions that we've provided are not set in stone. They're meant to be guidelines and sort of prompts for conversation. Some of the conversations we've started in the Q&A time. So questions about how does this content, how does the history and legacy of residential schools connect to us? And you can think about the us as, a family, a church, as the Synod. What is our responsibility to move forward? And then thinking about what actions can we take? How do we Let's start getting some practical ideas. Let's use this as a brainstorm. And then we also talked about including a question about what more do we need to learn, right? Again, the overview I provided is very high level. I mean, it might have felt really long as I was droning on, but it was, very introductory, right? So what more might you need to know or learn about to be good allies and do this work in a good way? So if there's things that you think, oh, it'd be nice if we learned more about X, this would also be, I think, a useful time to have that conversation. So again, just how does this content and information relate to us? What is our responsibility to move forward? What actions can we take? And what more do we need to know? So sort of 4 main questions. And you can think about this at the personal, the community, and the sort of larger system level.